Hey, have you guys heard about the new Parker Sporlan S3C case controller? Contractors, how about a case controller with a one-day setup, access to more data, and efficient system operation for the end user? The S3C series of case controllers provides contractors and store owners automated configuration and network integration. You can maintain precise food temperatures without supervisory control. Easily monitors to prevent product loss, and Bluetooth provides a local connection with the TechCheck mobile app. The series includes case controller display module, a valve supporting open protocol, communication via BACnet and Modbus. Sporlan's mobile app, the TechCheck, allows communication with the S3C case controller to enable proof of work, diagnostic, and data sharing. The S3C communicates with building automation systems and works with Sporlan's SPW series of pulse width modulation valves, also the SSR series of electronic expansion valves. Visit Sporlan.com for more information. 1, 2, 3. Let's do it.
All right, guys. Welcome to the Advanced Refrigeration Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Compass, along with Brett Wetzel. Today, we're going to continue the rack tuning and Really?
Yeah.
Continue the rack tuning and optimization podcast from last time. So we're going to go deeper into where to look for these opportunities, the low-hanging fruit, and like the harder to get fruit on the tree to, save some energy and at the same time make this stuff run better. So we're going to start kind of like diving into the actual tuning part of it. So, and how we go about it. So the first part, we're going to go where we save the most energy, where are the compressors. So
hold on here. Hold on. I want to hear how bad of a week you had this week.
Well, yeah, I've been back on service for a little bit. I don't know, and it's rough to say, at least. It's 90 degrees, and yeah, I've been doing callback.
I think we finally hit 100 this week.
Oh, fuck that! It's too hot.
No, yeah. Did you finish up all those compressors you had to change out?
Those are done. Another crew finished those, and we're going back next week to start the gas changeover. We got like 70 ball valves to do, and then all that stuff, and then I have a microthermal changeover to do. So, and I'm trying to ever avoid going down there again.
Down at St. Louis?
Yes. Never, ever, 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 ever again.
You've said that in the past too, right? You know that, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, never, ever, ever, ever again. But what about you, Brett? You got some news, maybe?
Yeah. Promotion. I'm now the manager of technical troubleshooting and training. So basically, I'll be able to go around the country. I'm already traveling 2 weeks out of the month, but now I'll be, traveling. Not just in Texas and Oklahoma. Like this week, I'm in Oklahoma, but basically, I'll be able to go to other branches. Be able to make a strong impact in the field and be able to, train people out, across the board. That was one of the reasons why, Kevin and I started this podcast. We want to make sure, everyone, a lot of people are happier when they know what they're doing. They don't feel like they're guessing all the time. And, I'm excited. Like I said, not only for, being able to work on different equipment and being able to train with different people, but, also, most importantly, be able to be with my family. So, yeah, so that's the big news. I wanted to see what was going to be going on, and that's what we got going on. And then actually today, we had a compressor up in Oklahoma where basically the the rack was cycling a lot. It was basically the compressors were cycling upwards of 538 times a day. As we said before, they're only supposed to cycle at max 240 cycles a day. We ended up changing some set points in the flash tank, which basically evened out everything else. We dropped the VFD a little bit. We want to try to get a little bit lower, but basically instead of turning off and on every 1 minute to 2 minute, now it'll run for about an hour before it actually drops down. So I posted some pictures so you guys see that it was, all these pressures were all over the place, and now it's basically a straight line. So we'll see what happens next week. We'll keep an update on that. And that's really all that I got going on.
Well, that was a lot.
Yeah, no.
You tend to trail off when you get older.
Shut up. Well, listen, I'm gonna be the best old person in the world because I can't wait till I hit senility. So I can yell at kids and give them the finger, and no one will be able to yell at me because I'm just getting old and senile. It'll be great. So.
All right. So let's dive into this. We're going to start this when we're looking at rack tuning, where I generally tend to start, and I don't know about you, but I tend to start at the rack first, and we're going to start looking over a couple things. We're looking for compressor cycling. Number one, easiest thing is save energy, save wear and tear if we want to get those compressors to stop cycling. So we got to go over a few things. We got to look over. We're graphing the suction pressure out. We don't want to see big swings. To me, if it's swinging more than 3 pounds, 2 to 3 pounds, I think pretty bad. I mean, for a newer rack, if you got a 20-year-old rack with the loads all messed up and you're swinging 2 to 3 pounds, that's not terrible. But why maintain those 3 pounds? Are you doing it at the sacrifice of cycling your compressors 500-600 times a day? I've seen racks where there's compressor cycles with over 700 a day. Me, right there, that's easy fruit to go after. Okay, now whether it be Danfoss, Emerson, Microthermal, they all have PID loops running the suction. They all have dead bands. So this is one thing you want to kind of look at, see what your dead bands are, see what your compressor sizes are, see how it's programmed in the controller, because that's how that controller is going to stage up that rack. It's looking at the load versus what it has for compressor sizes. Go ahead, Brett.
Make sure that the inversions are right. Make sure that the whatever it might be sized off of. I know the E2 basically it says horsepower under sizing. Basically the higher the number, the better. The higher the number, the algorithm that actually runs the enhanced suction does better with higher numbers. So, preferably do CFM. You could technically do discharge CFM. As long as the number's larger than basically horsepower you can use. Don't get me wrong, but you'll get a lot more, a lot steadier suction. With using a larger number. Now, remember, and I agree with you as far as the cycling, but that's all relative, right? Because you might have a rack that's 20 years old that there's nothing wrong physically with the rack, but if that rack was only intended to have unloaders, regular standard blocking suction unloaders, you really can't fault that for that unless you're going to try to sell up the customer, sell them up on a either an IDCM or some sort of digital unloading, or you're basically a VFD. So
well, yeah, that's what we're going to go into in a few minutes. Like that's where that opportunity comes in and that huge savings is there. But I 100% agree with you about the number of times if I don't have CFM, if I can't figure it out for that particular compressor, I'll even use BTUs. Like you said, as long as the number's, bigger. The bigger the number, the better. The better. Also, the second thing is, even if two compressors are the exact same, I make them at least one number. On at least one number. Because what it tends to do, especially with CPC, is it tries to equalize runtime between compressors. You have, say if you have a 15 horse, a 15 horse, and a 15 horse, it will start cycling those compressors. Even though it's good with one, it'll bring number 2 on and shut number 1 off. It'll start rotating compressors, which if it's running great with, say, that first compressor, why mess with it? So I tend to go one off on everything, even if they're all the same. So just to give the controller some choice there. So when it is doing that, it doesn't start to shuffle and start moving compressors. So the other thing is deadband. So your suction deadband, you want to make sure it's tight, but not too tight for your application. If you just have compressors and no unloaders, you may not be able to run a 2-pound deadband, pound up, 1 pound down. You may not be able to run that. You may need to run a 4-pound deadband. It all depends on what your load is. So the tighter you keep that deadband and the tighter you keep that suction without compressor cycles, if I see 175 cycles a day, I mean, that's where I'm concerned about. That's where I'm wanting to push the customer towards some kind of capacity control and digital compressor, a VFD. I mean, I usually try to go with a digital compressor because the actual install cost, the actual cost of the parts are way cheaper than putting a VFD in. A VFD is a lot of money. And then here's the other caveat of a VFD. A VFD is messing with your mass flow. A digital is not. So with that digital, Copeland says it doesn't mess with your mass flow like a VFD would. So you're keeping it more constant. I mean, a VFD is going to control your suction pressure better. It's tuned properly. It's going to give you better control. Now, when I'm going through this, you want to make sure your unloaders are set properly and they're wired properly. The dip switch is set up properly. I see this all the time, and Brett, I'm sure you see it a lot. Is you see dip switches set wrong on the CPC. You see the dip switch set wrong, and when it's calling for it to be on, it's off. When it's calling for it to be off, it's on. So that's one thing. Make sure your unloaders are actually functioning properly. So when it's calling for that unloader to be on, it's meaning in the controller, it's calling for more capacity. So say yours is 7.5 horse, and say the unloader's another 7.5 horse. So when it's on and it's just calling for the compressor, the unloader should be energized. If it's calling for both to be on, meaning it's calling for full horsepower, the full 15 horsepower, then it's going to cycle the unloader off because Copeland's are unloaded off. And same thing with Carlisle's. When they're energized, they unload. So same with Bitzers also. So you set it up where it's going to fail. It's going to fail loaded. So you're going to wire it normally open, dip switch down. So that way when it's called to be on, it's on. But when it's in fail safe, it's off. So that's one thing you want to look. You want to look through all your unloaders to make sure everything is functioning properly if you have them. When I'm looking through compressors, say I'm going to add an unloader to something. If adding an unloader to a suction group is way to kind of even out the load if you got some cycling. I mean, there's plenty of compressors that get shipped off with blank off plates on it. You throw an unloader on there, you spend a couple $100. I mean, that couple $100 would probably, on a badly cycling rack would pay off like almost immediately. You got to remember when it's not just the cycling of the rack, it's the peak current. That customer gets charged their peak current of the day. So say at 3 p.m. when that rack's cycling on and off like crazy, say there's a big defrost that rack's cycling like crazy, and you have a 6D banging on and off, and it's drawing 200, 300 amps. I mean, that racks are that pink KW that they have, depending on how their energy usage is set up. So that may dictate their entire day. So trying to reduce the cycling and keep the compressors running is like the most important thing, and that is the easiest fruit to grab. They say it's generally, I think, is it 2%, Brett, for every pound you float the suction?
Yeah, for 1 PSI, I think it's 2% you save on the electric bill. And then I think on discharge pressure, it's the same. I'm sorry, not the same. It's 1%,
right?
one PSI.
So if you really think about this, guys, I mean, there's tons of racks. When I go around to all these stores, I travel just like Brett does. I go to all these stores and I see it all the time. I see racks with guys lower the suction pressure because they can't make cases, make temp or whatever. I mean, when you lower the suction pressure on a rack, you cause cycling issues. Lowering the suction pressure on a rack does not keep it running longer. Like that's a common misconception with a lot of guys out there. It does not. You want to increase your suction pressure to keep that rack running longer because you want to keep the load up. You want to keep everything more constant. You want EPRs more open. If you have EPRs pinching down on you, what ends up happening is, if your suction saturation is too low, that EPR is going to start pinching down, whether it's the CDS valve and it's going to be going off discharge air temp. It's even worse with those. Or say you have pilot-driven EPRs. Once you start getting below that, so say all your EPRs are maintaining like 20-degree saturated temperature and your rack's running 15 degrees. Well, you have a 5-degree difference between the EPRs and the racks. So those things are going to start shutting down, and now you're going to start losing load to the rack, and you're going to start this cycling issue. So generally, the first step I look at when I start looking at cycling issues is after I look through the compressors to make sure they're all set up properly, I start looking at my my suction pressure and start looking where I could see, to save improvements. I mean, I generally will set the suction pressure at whatever the coldest case is. So if I say my coldest case is 20 degrees, it requires a 20-degree evaporator coil, I'll set the case to that. Then I'll check it at the case, make sure I don't have a huge pressure drop. You shouldn't have more than a pound or two. I mean, especially on newer stores, you shouldn't have more than a pound, really. I mean, they're being very generous with suction lines now. A lot of older guys will say you need 2 degrees colder than the coldest case. I don't do that. I mean, even that will cause cycling issues at times. So I generally try to put it at the coldest case, and then I'll run it there. If I can get it higher, I'm going to float it. Any chance I can, I'm going to float the suction. That's where your rack will just steady out with the load, and it'll also just kind of calm down. So, I mean, you get that SST as close as you can to what the cases need. All those EPRs open up, you get constant flow back, and everything will calm down. That's where your big savings is.
I remember like the rule that he said that the old timers use. It's basically, I mean, if you look at any rack refrigeration schedule, you'll actually see that let's just say the rack is set for it's trying to maintain 16 degrees suction. Your coldest SSC case will probably be 18 degrees, and that's really to account for for pressure drop, right? Because I mean, just because you have 16 degrees, or let's just say 43 pounds, right there at the rack, doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna have 43 pounds, all the way out of your case, right? So I mean, that was the reason for it. If the case has been there for a while, you will see that's that no more than 2 pound drop. Now we're trying to make sure that the suction pressure at the rack is basically just about exactly the same as the case, the case that's out all the way out. You want to make sure that you don't have that pressure drop, and that's why we end up floating that pressure up, so we can end up lowering our compression ratio. Lowering the compression ratio is anywhere from bringing down the head pressure as easy as cleaning a coil, and raising the suction pressure. The tighter we can get that gap in between the suction and discharge pressure, the better.
So the one thing Brett was talking about, that pressure drop, I see this a lot when I do commissionings and stuff. I'll do, say it's not our store and I'm in there doing commissionings and going through stuff, and I get a lot of pushback from contractors there. Oh, this is going to cause problems. We have this problem with this case. Generally, that's not a rack problem. That's an actual problem with the case, or it's set up wrong. But this is what I want to say about the pressure drop. I had people say, okay, well now I have a 4-pound pressure drop on this case, or a 5-pound pressure drop. We can't do this. We can't float. I'll tell you right now, change out that suction line and getting rid of that pressure drop. You'd be surprised how many customers will do that, because say it costs $10,000 to change out that suction line, that one line. Cost some fitters, one night to rerun the line. Say it costs $10,000. That may get paid back in less than 6 to 8 months, in energy savings. I mean, so people don't realize how big the energy bill is, the electric bill is in a supermarket, especially a quite large supermarket. It's big. I mean, it's their biggest expense next to labor.
I've heard upwards of like $30,000-$40,000 a month, right? Depending on how big the supermarket is.
Yeah, we had some independents in my last shop that I did the commissionings. Some 2-3 store owners. Like I got to see their bills. When we were going through and I was recommissioning stores. I got to see their bills. We had one store who was upwards of $48,000. I mean, it was not a very large store, but it was old equipment. Like you're talking like 30-year-old racks. I mean, he's paying upwards of almost $50,000 for an electric bill a month. I mean, we cut $15,000 to $20,000 off the bill a month just by rerunning some lines. We changed a couple condensers and stuff like that and rebuilt the racks. But I mean, this is where this comes in. So like guys, if you have these big pressure drops, bring it up. I mean, get rid of these big pressure drops. I mean, that way you can float the rack. I mean, you'd be surprised how many customers will spend $10,000 to save 30. I mean, that's a no-brainer when you're telling a customer, hey, Mr. Customer, you can pick up this line. We can't float the rack. This is done. I mean, it's going to cost you $10,000, but it's going to save you, $30,000 every year. I mean, that's a no-brainer right there. So that's why you want to get this taken care of. And I mean, the pressure drops, you want to try to keep them as low as you can. I mean, everything new, I've seen like pressure drops a pound and a half. So that's why we want to float the suction. And then after we get the suction kind of tuned in, and everything running properly on that, then I'm going to start looking at my liquid pressure and my condenser. So Brett, you kind of go into the condenser tuning?
Yeah. We want to make sure that, we do have a steady load on everything. The better off we are as far as keeping the pressures more steady. Because you got to remember, we had a discussion before about how expansion valves basically, are constantly opening and closing to compensate for the change in pressure, and that's why, customers like Sam's Club and Sprouts, they use LPRVs to keep the liquid pressure more steady, right? They use VFDs. Because basically, if anyone's ever adjusted a TXV on a Sam's Club, that valve takes a heck of a lot longer to, basically catch up to the adjustment than like your Stop and Shop or your Target, where basically, you adjust that valve and it'll react fairly quickly because, basically that discharge or liquid pressure is always moving around. so the steadier you basically have your liquid pressure, the steadier the valve is it's going to make a smooth transition from opening to closing. If you have it all over the place, that means the valve's going to be all over the place, which means you are potentially going to overfeed and underfeed it. It's gonna hunt a little bit, but not I'm not talking severity of 2 to 20 degrees of superheat. I'm just talking about instead of maintaining right on the money for 6 or 8 degrees of superheat, it might go up to 10 and might come back down to to 5. It might overshoot a little bit because of that change in pressure. So we do want to make sure that we have that pretty straight. We can, like I said, we can control the fans with VFDs. We have those the MPAS motors. I just recently saw ECM motors, 3-phase ECM motors on some of these Keep Right condensers. Basically, maintaining a more steady liquid pressure. So like I said, the steadier everything else goes, the better. A lot of times, that this is when you start messing with the PID. PID stands for proportional integral derivative. Basically, it takes into account like how fast and how slow it's going to react based off the numbers that you have programmed. There's certain things like if you look at a Sporlan subcool control, that's fantastic because it basically tells you, for the PID, it says, hey, if you decrease the I, basically the valve is going to react a little bit faster. So on a lot of these other things like the condenser control and stuff, they really don't tell you what it's going to do. So I mean, at that point, PID, I've been trying to understand fully for years, and it really comes down to you playing with the PID settings, see what works, see what doesn't, and basically, that's how I got accustomed to trying to adjust PID. I've read every little excerpt, every little blurb that I can find about PID control. But like I said, there are some manufacturers where they'll say, oh well, by lowering this temperature, or this number, it's gonna increase the how aggressive it's gonna react. The proportional band is basically, if I'm not mistaken, Kevin, please tell me if I'm correct. Basically, it's the margin of error between the actual set point and what you actually have right now, as far as your setting.
So proportional is trying to bring you back down to set point from error. So it's the calculated amount from the process variable, whatever you're measuring, versus to your set point. What ends up happening is with we generally only run loops in HVAC, refrigeration, and stuff like that. We're not usually using the D loop. So proportional, brings you back down to set point. Integral ends up smoothing out the sine wave. So proportional, if you just run a P loop, what's going to happen is you're gonna shoot and overshoot, shoot and overshoot, and undershoot. It's going to be this sine wave. So what integral does is error over time. So it's looking at the error over time and adding a multiplier to that, and it's trying to bring that to a straight line across the set point. Now, derivative is trying to predict error over time. That's why you get into this like sticky situation with a D. Whenever you introduce the D, you end up kind of overcomplicating things. We usually only need PI loops. So generally, when I'm tuning a loop, I will take the I down to 0. And I like 0.25 on the proportional, and I'll just keep increasing the proportional until I get a somewhat smooth loop, and then I'll start using I like 0.1 at a time to try to kind of smooth it out. Now I will tell you this: I've been trying to do the same thing in these PI loops, as good as Brett explained it. I will tell you this: I work with Microthermal, Danfoss, CPC, RDM, Nova, you name it. Everybody's PI loops are different. There's ones in Microthermal that are direct acting and reverse acting, meaning like you raise the eye, makes it act slower. There's PI loops in Microthermal where you raise it goes. Same thing with Emerson and Dixel. The PI loops are completely different. One it reacts one way, one reacts the other way. So that's just one thing you gotta keep in mind when you're doing this stuff. So generally, you don't have to mess with PI loops very much. I generally only change them on a condenser. But all right, let's talk about condenser programming with a VFD. So you use a TD condenser, plain and simple. Best energy efficiency way to control the condenser is off a TD, from outside air to what you have. Now, if your customer is not demanding a TD to you, I generally will clean the condenser, make sure it's spotless clean and running. Try to, on the hottest day, try to see what you got. Your TD is going to kind of float with load. So, I mean, that condenser may be a 10-degree TD. You may be able to run 8, depending on what your load is. I mean, you're never going to be 100% loaded. And then if you are, you have more problems. I mean, you should run with one compressor off at least.
Hey guys, I want to take a break and talk about Westermeyer, one of our other sponsors. Today's episode is sponsored by Westermeyer Industries, the leader in oil management and pressure vessels for the commercial refrigeration industry.
Go ahead, Brett.
This may sound extremely dumb, but make sure that you have the right motor in there. Make sure you have the right fan blade in there. It sounds really dumb, but these condensers are sized for what is in them. You're not going to be able to maintain the TD that's specified on the condenser if you don't have the right fan blade moving across the right amount of air. We had an instance like that where our subcooling sucked. We weren't getting any subcooling really whatsoever, and come to find out that a lot of times supply houses will get you the typical 5-fan bone or Heatcraft 5-fan fan blade, and they'll just throw that on. Well, some of these older condensers, they say Tyler on them. If you do see a condenser with Tyler on them, FYI, it's actually made by WIT. Just so you're aware. And basically, they had the wrong fan blade on them. And two things happened. One, we weren't maintaining good subcooling at all coming out of the drain leg. But on top of that, we kept going through motors prematurely. The blades were too aggressive, and then basically what was ending up happening is the motors were would overamp, and then basically just eat up the windings, and you're changing out a couple more condenser fan motors in a couple of days.
Yeah, I mean, big thing, fans are blowing out straight and not out the side. If they're blowing out the side, you could have the wrong blades, wrong motors, or you could be impacted and be dirty. So that's another big thing. Make sure the condensers are blowing straight up. So like I was saying about that TD, it could actually be, say, 15 degrees. You could be closer to 8. It all depends on the load on the rack. So you want to test warm day with the rack as low as it's going to get. Now, when you do this, I usually set my TD to what it actually is. I have a customer spec and they spec 10 degrees for the medium temp or low temp. I set it to whatever customer spec is because you got to play that game. But if I can get it and it's actually lower, set your TD to whatever it actually is. So make sure you're maintaining a good TD. Now, you also want to set a minimum and maximum SCT. So you want a minimum saturated condensing temperature. Below 65 to 70 degrees, if you try running the head lower than that on a standard rack, you're going to actually spend more energy on fan horsepower than you're going to save on compressor horsepower. So they say generally like 65 to 70 degrees saturated condensing temperature is where you line to where it's not energy efficient to try to lower that head anymore. Now, there is obvious like caveats to that where you could slam her all the way down to 75 pounds or something and, basically running on nothing like an EnviroGuard. But that's a different, it'll be a different podcast because it's a different animal altogether. So you want to hit that minimum, and you want to make sure you're actually making that minimum in the wintertime. I mean, you may have to adjust your split set point a little bit depending on your rack load. You may have to split it 40 degrees. Just pay attention to that. And then you also want to set a maximum above like 88, 89 degree condensing, 90 degree condensing temperature. You're no longer saving energy by reducing the fan horsepower. Now you need to get rid of that discharge temp. So you don't want those compressors running any hotter than they need to be. Right? So you're not saving any energy. So once I get to that, like we said in the last episode, I write a program. There's different ways to do it in CPC to write a max condensing temperature. Danfoss has it. Microthermal has it. So just make sure that that's programmed in there, so that way you aren't running your compressors harder than you need to. So the next part about it, let's talk about fan cycling. Fan cycling is terrible generally. Fan cycling leads to motors dropping through coils, leads to broken blades, worn out motors. The more you keep those fans running, the better. So let's talk about a couple of things. I mean, if you have standard motors and no VFD, you're kind of screwed. Let's just be honest. I mean, you're going to have fan cycling. I mean, you got to have some like play in there for you can't have your throttle range super tight. Go ahead, Brett.
One of the other things you can do to combat that a little bit, because we've had that happen. Just like you said, they're going to break apart. And if anyone's ever had that call at 2:00 in the morning where you go check your suction and your discharge pressure, and you're basically at 0.5 or 0.7 psi, and basically you have no gas in there. They're trying to figure out why that actually happened. Most of the time it is because either wrong fan blade on there, overcycling on the unit. Basically you can help some of that by playing with the PID. Target racks are big on this, where basically there is no VFD. You're basically just cycling the fans off and on based off the head pressure. You can do a little bit something with it, or basically the eye on the PID. A lot of times I'll drop it down all the way down to 0.2 or 0.02, basically giving that controller a little bit more time to reflect on what the control pressure is before it makes its next decision, whether to drop out another condenser fan motor or turn on another one.
Yeah, so the other thing, like you could adjust, I mean, I could adjust on standard stuff before I start messing with the PID loop, is the throttling range. I mean, sometimes you may have to take the throttling range as high as like 25, 30 on the floating head for to kind of cut down on that cycling. I mean, you're kind of at the will of that. I mean, you want to make sure you don't have hundreds of cycles a day on motors. I mean, when it's super cold out, I mean, it's somewhat unavoidable. I live in Chicago. I mean, it goes from 100 degrees down to minus 20. So you can only imagine, we get these swing months where, we're in between split, where we're not, we're having cycling issues with motors. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I mean, it's pretty cheap to sell the customer a VFD. A VFD is a quick payback on a condenser. I mean, you're save upwards of, they say with floating head, it's anywhere from 11 to 12%. It's 15 to 20%, it's energy savings a year with floating head and VFD. So, I mean, a VFD is a thing. So let's the VFD actual side of it. So when you do have a VFD controlled condenser, couple things that I like to do is I try to run my throttling ranges pretty low, like 10 pound or 10, the throttling range at 10, it's in degrees. So it's going to be around that set point. And the other thing I also do is I try to You see a lot of times, I see it all over the place. I don't know why guys do this, but they put the variable speed increase and decrease rates at like 2,000 RPMs or something crazy like that. So this makes this hunting. So what I generally do is 300 to 400 RPM increase, and I'll do like a 400 to 500 RPM decrease. So you want your decrease a little bit faster than your increase. You don't need this huge increase. I mean, if you're going to hit this threshold, say you have an emergency situation, your head pressure spikes up like tremendously, you're still going to spool up fast enough, and it does hit the fast recovery or hit something else, it's going to spool you all the way up immediately. So don't worry about that. You just, when a compressor turns on for the first minute and you get a 10-pound spike, you don't want it to spool all the way up. I mean, because that's what ends up happening. You want it to spool slowly, so that way you don't get this this hunting up and down, up and down, up and down, and that VFD is all over the place. Because you got to remember that you have an increase rate and decrease rate on that VFD, of anywhere from 20 to 30 seconds. So this lag between the controllers. So that's why you want to really watch how you do these throttling ranges and your increase and decrease rates. I don't know why guys set it to 2,000. I think it runs absolutely terrible when it's that high. It just causes this terrible hunting.
What's the recommended setting? I heard something about basically if let's just say the RPM is 850, how many seconds typically should it take for that condenser fan motor to basically spool all the way up?
I would say 25 to 30 seconds
for it to ramp all the way from point A to point B. I'm just saying, like, for what you programmed, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would take. So say if there was an emergency situation, it would be whatever the drive increase and decrease rates is 20 to 30 seconds. So yeah. Were you stuffing your mouth with a cookie?
Mm-hmm. I'm hungry.
So that's one thing you want to really watch is those increase rates and decrease rates, and make sure your RPMs are programmed correctly. The RPMs in like Emerson and CPC and Danfoss really don't mean anything. You could have 1250 motors or 1140 motors, and you could have it could be at 850. Okay, it doesn't really. It's just the way it's the algorithm. So it's not telling that drive to run at 850. That's got to be programmed inside the drive itself. So inside the controller, that's just the scaling inside the controller. So I mean, that's going to be scaling in there. So I mean, I slow mine down, and then I also mess with my PIDs accordingly if I need to, depending on how bad it's cycling. But usually it smooths out with that increase and decrease rate. So I mean, you want to make sure you're not cycling fans on and off. With micro channel coils, a VFD is a must. If you don't have a VFD and you have just fan cycling, you got screwed by some manufacturer or some salesman, because you're going to be changing slabs like no other. The metal increases and decreases way too fast with temperature, and that's why those slabs crack when fans start cycling. You don't want to cycle fans on micro channel condensers, because it stresses the aluminum too much and causes them to leak.
When you're talking about the slabs, are you just talking about
You're muted, Brett.
the side? Are you talking what part of the condenser when you're referring to the slab? What are you
so the micro channel, like
okay,
the V style micro channel coils, like the crack ones.
Yeah, crack Hussman.
So yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You can't cycle. You don't want to cycle fans on those, because what ends up happening is that aluminum will, like, we watched it with a thermal imager. I took some apprentices up the one day. It was like 10 degrees outside. That coil went from almost 90 degrees down to like 35, 40 degrees. in less than like 30, 40 seconds. From that, the air is just so efficient. Those coils are so efficient at that temperature, and it just causes you think that aluminum's expanding and contracting that much. It ends up causing stress cracks. That's why those things leak. I mean, those things are almost need a VFD on them. That's why you see them when they drop out the fans. That's why Husband's been wiring them lately to shut off that bank when the last fan shuts off, so that way they aren't pushing refrigerant through there and heating the coil up when the fan's not running. So that's why they tend to do it like that.
And the reason why they use the microchannel is because they're trying to reduce the amount of gas charge. Because there's so much surface area, you're not needing nearly as much, refrigerant in there. So that's the reason why all these manufacturers are going to the microchannel. That's one of the biggest reasons.
Yeah, I mean, they're fine as long as they have VFDs on them and they're properly set up. They don't leak. I mean, they leak on occasion here and there, but not like they did 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when they were just throwing them out there with no VFDs on them. They were leaking all over the place. I mean, there was brand new condensers we were changing slabs on every couple of weeks when they first came out. So that's one thing is to keep in mind. Now, once we move on past the condenser and compressor, I mean, that's where we're going to get our big savings at. I start looking at my defrost schedule. So this is a big thing. Like, I see a lot of overlapping defrost. Now, when you're going through a defrost schedule, the defrost schedule has a ton of bearing on your suction group, so on how steady your suction is. So you should never have two hot gas things in defrost at once. You need to put your loads out for defrost, and you generally do not want hot gas defrost loads after 10 a.m. So after 10 a.m. and usually about 9:30 at night, I'll start defrosting again. So glass doors should only be once a day, or whatever the manufacturer spec is. If you have case with more than one defrost a day, so say the manufacturer calls for one and there's two or three, somebody's hiding a problem, and that's just causing a huge energy increase. You got to remember, you're causing an increase on the rack energy usage. It costs money to defrost, even if it's hot gas. Defrost is not free, and that's a huge energy savings right there. Is make sure you got these defrosts. Generally, try to hide something when you see like 3 hot gas defrosts in a case a day. Generally, there's a piping issue, a defrost differential issue. There's some sort of issue out there that somebody has something set up wrong. So generally, most hot gas cases, for an actual case, is going to have 1 defrost a day. I always start manufacturer spec, and I'll go a little bit out from there. And then another big thing is terminations. If you don't have termination temps, you may have to kind of play with it a little bit. If it's circuit piped, I'll generally throw a temp probe on there, and I'll watch and see how long it takes to hit termination. Coming back in the middle of summertime, if it's with a frost load on the coil, I'll time it out. Once it gets to like 60, 65 degrees, and the liquid coming back, I'll usually make that my defrost time.
Now, be mindful, with hot gas, they don't want any more than 5% going in to defrost at any given point in time. The reason why they don't want it during the day as well, because obviously energy costs more money during the day than what it does at night. You also don't want, it starts getting tricky, especially when you're dealing with medium temp stuff and even off time. Basically you don't want a whole bunch of stuff, coming out of defrost at the same time, which can prove difficult sometimes. We've had these discussions before. So you have like the 05 DM NRG, those cases typically have about 6 defrosts a day. You have some Kaiser Warren cases that have anywhere of 12 to 18 a day. Yes, that wasn't a mistake. It's 12 to 18 a day. I don't know when the hell they run. But basically that's the way they're designed. So like I said, sometimes trying to, get them so they're not, you basically don't have, any of this stuff overlapping and because once again, you shut down a whole bunch of stuff all at one shot. What's going to happen to your suction pressure? It's going to drop. Same principle when it comes out of defrost. As soon as it comes out of defrost, now you have, potentially 4 tons of load now coming back to the rack. So now you have to load up that compressor and really quickly, and maybe have to bring on another one, which is more wear and tear, right? We're trying to keep the compressors, kind of just sailing and not have to keep bringing this one on, this one off, this one on, this one off. We want to keep the load as steady as possible, because that is going to end up saving our energy, and that's part of this whole rack tuning process. We want everything really even. We want everything basically running at a nice stream.
Yeah, so when I do my defrost scheduling is almost one of the most important parts of this. Guys leave it out a lot, especially when it comes to CO2. With CO2, it is almost the most important part. So when I do my defrost scheduling, like Brett said, some of these cases are going to have overlapping. So what I will do is I will take the rack legend with me with all loads, and I'll write down all my defrost times I need, and I will sit there and I will figure out cases that can defrost together. So I always check the rack. I will always start with the rack's largest loads. I will always defrost those, make sure those by themselves. Okay, when I'm doing this, my whole goal here is two things. If a large load is going into defrost, nothing else is in defrost. When that load is coming out, I'm going to try. This is almost impossible, and you can get close. Try to match loads around the same BTUs and put them in defrost at the same time. So say that at midnight, this case of 30,000 BTUs goes in defrost. It's a half-hour defrost. It comes out at 12:30. So at 12:30, I'm going to put my next case in defrost. So this does two things. It evens out the load, and then when that case comes back, when we have all those BTUs coming back to the rack, we have a high load, we're dropping off around the same amount of load. So we don't get this increase. We're not staging up. We're not staging down. We're just kind of managing. So you try to maintain. You may have to combine two cases to make up for that one bigger case you're losing. So that's what I'll do. I'll do smaller loads together, large loads by themselves. I'll kind of even it out. And then whenever one's coming in, I want one going out. So then I'm losing horsepower and gaining horsepower, or I'm gaining BTUs and I'm losing BTUs. So that's how I'll try to do it. I see these defrost schedules. Just about every store I go into that isn't spec a certain way. The defrost schedules are horrendous. Guys, with them, they add times. They don't look at overlapping stuff, or they have, I was just at a major retailer site that we're doing some recommissioning at, and probably close to 175,000 BTUs were going into defrost at the same time. So you're talking the rack would crash, go down to one compressor, the digital would completely unload. It would sit there, it would struggle, it would come back, boom, after defrost, it would have 4 compressors running. And then it would overshoot, everything would come down, we would start to frost coils on occasion, and we'd be back down to running 1 or 2 compressors and some weird cycling. So that defrost schedule is imperative to try to get it close. With hot gas, you generally don't want 2 things in defrost at once. If you're going to do it, it's going to be 2 little loads, but you're going to not defrost properly. I see a lot of times guys are adding defrost times, hot gas, like glass doors, for example, and you look at it and you got 2 12-door cases or 2 15-door cases going into defrost at once. But yeah, in the wintertime, that rack can't defrost 30 doors at once. For one's going to get better flow than the other, and the hot gas is going to favor that case. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind. And then your defrost differential valve, sure it's set to the bare minimum you could go for. And, you don't want to see it 30, 35. I've been to stores with 50. That's a huge energy waste. You're just boosting up the head pressure when you don't need it. So you want to make sure that defrost differential valve is set, as low as you can get with the proper flow to your cases. So that way you're not increasing or starving stuff, or making your head pressure artificially higher than it needs to be. But you need to get that defrost tuned out. That's a huge thing. And then your termination temps for medium temp. I generally try to terminate on medium temp. I will terminate off case temperature. Another thing you could do if you're terminating off case temperature, tell with Emerson, for example, you could tell it has tell the circuit, say you don't have term sensors, you could tell it has term sensors. Okay, and you can put your case temp sensors as term sensors, and then you could set minimum defrost times that way, and you could set your termination temp to minimum. We want to terminate off minimum, so that way your coldest case, make sure it defrosts all the way. But that's one way. I mean, over defrosting medium temp cases causes more load on the rack. We want to keep the load as low as we can on the rack. Over defrosting wastes energy. Even if it's medium temp, it's a waste of energy.
One thing that can be done to combat this is it sounds dumb, but making sure your superheats are even across the board. You're typically supposed to, well, I'm not going to say typically, you're always supposed to be defrosting your defrost termination off of the min temperature. Basically, we want to do that to make sure that, for some reason, one case is hitting defrost, 20 minutes beforehand. Well, that's fine, but still the lowest temp case still hasn't reached, termination. So we want to make sure that, we're basically, high enough, that we're going to be able to, defrost, all of those cases on that lineup. But, like I said, having the cases evened out, making sure that the superheats are even on them, making sure there's no air blowing in from another spot, whether it be a discharge air, it could be a vent, it could be something as simple as the building having negative pressure on it. Basically sucking air, into that front door instead of having the building on a positive pressure.
Yeah, I mean that is another. There's going to be a third part to this, and we're going to kind of include the building in the case. So they generally say it's anywhere from a 5 to 10% energy savings if going through and retuning all the superheats in the store. Resetting everything, cleaning everything, getting everything moving. As you get that suction gas colder, it becomes more dense. More dense gas is more efficient to pump. So it makes that, if your superheat the rack is, 25 to 35, it's going to be more efficient than your superheat's 50. At 50 degrees, it increases the energy usage on that pump. If you don't believe me, look at the Copeland app and the Copeland mobile. It'll show you what your energy increasage is if you lower that suction gas temperature or you raise that suction gas temperature. Colder gas is easier to compress. So you want to keep it cold, but you want to make sure you protect your compressors also. So you want to make sure your superheats are set dead on. I mean, I try to get them as low as I can. That way you can float that suction higher. So, I mean, it all starts peeling off into one big picture here. You get the rack running properly, then you go to the cases, you get the cases running properly. And as it all starts coming together, that cycling goes away, you start running properly. And let's say the cycling doesn't go away. Then it's time to introduce unloaders or digital compressors and stuff like that. Brad, I think we're going to wrap it up tonight, and we'll do part 3 next time. We'll start bringing in the digital compressors and stuff like that, and how I go through picking them, and then we'll bring in the envelope part of it. Kind of making sure the static pressures and stuff. But all right, guys, thanks for listening. Have a nice night.
Later, guys.